A shy girl sings alone in an empty subway station at midnight, her voice echoing through the tunnels like a prayer no one was meant to hear. The man listening from the shadows is Marcus Chen, CEO of Apex Records, who disappeared from the music industry 2 years ago after destroying the career of his most promising artist. Her song contains a melody he thought was buried forever, one that will force him to face the wreckage he left behind. The last train had departed Penn Station 47 minutes ago, leaving behind only the whisper of settling steel and the distant hum of ventilation systems breathing life into the underground maze. Above, New York City pulsed with its familiar rhythm of late-night energy, but down here in the belly of the transit system, silence had claimed its territory. Zara Okafor clutched her worn leather satchel closer to her chest as she descended. The stairs to Platform 7, the most forgotten corner of the station where even the maintenance crews rarely ventured. Her sneakers made soft, squeaking sounds against the damp concrete, each step echoing in the cavernous space like tiny heartbeats in an empty chest. The fluorescent lights flickered sporadically, casting dancing shadows that transformed the ordinary subway platform into something that felt almost sacred. She had discovered this place 3 months ago during one of her late shifts at the hospital laundry facility upstairs. Working the graveyard shift meant finishing at 2 a.m. when the subway had already shut down for the night. Rather than waiting for the expensive taxi ride back to her shared apartment in Queens, she had learned to navigate the maze of service tunnels and forgotten platforms, finding quiet corners where she could rest until the morning trains resumed. But tonight was different. Tonight, the weight of another rejection email sat heavy in her chest, and the melody that had been haunting her dreams for weeks demanded to be released into the world, even if that world consisted only of empty subway tiles and sleeping pigeons. Zara set down her bag and pulled out her phone, scrolling to the voice memo app she used to capture musical ideas. The screen showed dozens of recordings, fragments of songs she hummed while folding hospital linens, choruses that came to her during long bus rides, bridges that materialized in the space between sleep and waking. None of them had ever been heard by another human being. She pressed record and closed her eyes, letting the melody rise from somewhere deep in her throat where it had been waiting patiently for this moment. The song began as a whisper, barely audible above the ambient sounds of the station, but gradually grew stronger as her confidence found its footing in the darkness. The lyrics spoke of dreams deferred but not abandoned, of voices that sing in empty rooms, because the act of singing itself is what keeps the soul alive. Her voice carried a texture that seemed to absorb the sadness of the subway tiles and transform it into something luminous, a sound that belonged neither to classical training nor popular convention, but existed in some untrained space between heartbreak and hope. What Zara didn't know was that she wasn't alone. Marcus Chen stood in the service corridor 30 feet away, hidden behind a maintenance pillar, his body pressed against the cold concrete wall, as if trying to disappear into the infrastructure itself. He had been coming to this abandoned platform for 8 months now, ever since the insomnia had become unbearable, and his Tribeca penthouse had started feeling like a museum of his former life. The man who had once commanded boardrooms filled with industry executives and discovered artists who went on to win Grammy Awards, now spent his nights wandering the forgotten spaces beneath the city, seeking something he couldn't name in places where no one would recognize his face or remember the headlines that had ended his career. Marcus wore a faded Columbia University hoodie, the kind of anonymity uniform that made him invisible among the city's late-night wanderers. His salt and pepper beard had grown longer than he'd ever allowed during his corporate days, and the designer glasses had been replaced with drugstore reading glasses that made him look more like a graduate student than a former music industry powerhouse. He had descended to platform 7 tonight, following his usual routine of walking until exhaustion overtook the relentless churning of his thoughts. But as Zara's voice began to fill the space, something in his chest seemed to crack open, like a seed that had been waiting 2 years for the right conditions to germinate. The melody she sang contained echoes of a song he knew intimately, a song that had been the centerpiece of his greatest professional triumph and his most devastating personal failure. The harmonic progressions were different. The rhythm had evolved, but underneath it all lived the emotional DNA of a composition that had cost him everything. Elena Rodriguez had been 22 when she first walked into his office at Apex Records, carrying a demo CD and wearing the same nervous energy that every aspiring artist brought to their meetings with him. But Elena had possessed something rarer than talent. She had authentic vulnerability combined with technical skill, the kind of artistic integrity that couldn't be manufactured or imitated. Marcus had signed her immediately and spent the next 18 months crafting her debut album with the obsessive attention of a master jeweler setting precious stones. Every arrangement, every production choice, every marketing decision had been filtered through his vision of who Elena could become if given the proper platform and protection. The album had been titled Underground Melodies, a collection of songs Elena had written about her childhood in foster care, her struggle to afford music school, and her belief that broken things could be rebuilt into something beautiful. The title track had been her masterpiece, a haunting ballad that seemed to contain every emotion the human heart was capable of experiencing. But success in the music industry often came with invisible price tags, and Marcus had learned too late that his devotion to Elena's career had crossed lines he hadn't even realized existed. The industry press had started referring to him as possessive and controlling. Elena herself had begun to withdraw, complaining that she felt like a product being managed rather than an artist being supported. The breaking point had come during a late-night recording session when Elena had suggested changing the bridge in Underground Melodies. Marcus had dismissed her idea without consideration, explaining with condescending patience why his artistic vision was superior to her instincts about her own song. The argument that followed had been witnessed by the entire production team and had ended with Elena walking out of the studio at 3 a.m., leaving behind her guitar and her contract. She had never returned to Apex Records. Within a week, she had signed with a competitor label and released a statement accusing Marcus of creative manipulation and emotional abuse. The statement had been carefully worded by lawyers, but the damage to his reputation had been immediate and comprehensive. The industry that had once celebrated Marcus as a visionary had turned against him, with the swift brutality reserved for fallen gods. Artists on his roster had requested to be released from their contracts. Business partners had quietly severed their relationships. Music publications that had once featured him on their covers now ran exposés about the toxic culture at Apex Records, but the detail that had truly destroyed him wasn't professional, it was personal. Elena's final interview had included a single sentence that had haunted every quiet moment since, "He made me afraid to trust my own voice." Now, standing in the shadows of an abandoned subway platform, Marcus listened to a young woman sing with the same raw authenticity that had first drawn him to Elena's music. But where Elena's voice had carried the weight of experience, this stranger's voice held something different, a purity that hadn't yet been corrupted by industry politics or professional disappointment. Zara's song reached its climax, her voice soaring through the underground space with a power that seemed to make the fluorescent lights burn brighter. She sang about finding strength in solitude, about melodies that existed even when no one was listening, about the courage required to create art in a world that often seemed indifferent to beauty. Marcus found himself leaning forward, straining to hear every nuance of her performance. There was something in her phrasing that reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place, back when he was a teenager, sneaking into concert venues and believing that the right song could change everything. As Zara's voice began to fade, settling back into the whispered vulnerability with which she had begun, Marcus faced a choice that would determine whether he remained a ghost haunting the ruins of his former life or found the courage to risk everything again. He could walk away, let this moment exist as a beautiful accident that no one else would ever know about. Or he could step out of the shadows and confront the possibility that redemption might still be possible, even for someone who had forgotten how to trust his own intentions. The last note hung in the air between them like a question waiting for an answer, and in that suspended moment, both Zara and Marcus stood at the threshold of a story that would force them both to redefine what it meant to find your voice in a world that had taught them to doubt everything they thought they knew about themselves. Zara opened her eyes as the final note dissolved into the ambient hum of the subway station, her heart still racing from the vulnerability of performance. She had sung louder than intended, her voice carrying further into the tunnels than she had planned. The echoes seemed to linger in the air, as if the concrete walls themselves were reluctant to let the melody go. She quickly stopped the recording on her phone and slipped it back into her satchel, suddenly self-conscious about the intimacy she had just shared with the empty platform. This was her secret ritual, her way of processing the accumulated weight of another day spent invisible in a city that moved too fast to notice the quiet dreamers who kept its machinery running. The hospital laundry facility where she worked existed in the basement of Mount Sinai, a fluorescent-lit maze of industrial washing machines and sorting tables where she spent 8 hours a night transforming chaos into order. Her co-workers were mostly other immigrants and night-shift veterans who understood the economy of exhaustion that governed their shared world. They spoke little during their shifts, each lost in their own private calculations of survival and aspiration. Zara had been born in Lagos, but raised in Brooklyn after her family immigrated when she was 7. Her father drove a taxi during the day and studied for his medical licensing exams at night, while her mother cleaned office buildings and sent half her earnings back to relatives in Nigeria. Music had been Zara's refuge during the difficult years of cultural adjustment, her way of finding beauty in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving. She had learned to sing by listening to her grandmother's old Afrobeat records, studying the way Fela Kuti could make his voice both vulnerable and defiant within the same phrase. But she had also absorbed the gospel traditions of the Baptist church her family attended, where she learned that music could be both personal prayer and communal celebration. By high school, Zara had begun writing her own songs, crafting melodies that blended the polyrhythmic complexity of her African heritage with the emotional directness of American soul music. Her music teachers had encouraged her to audition for conservatories, but the financial reality of her family's situation had made such dreams feel impossibly distant. Instead, she had enrolled in community college and taken the hospital job to help support her family while she pursued a nursing degree. Music had become something she practiced in stolen moments, humming while she folded linens, writing lyrics on napkins during her lunch breaks, recording voice memos on her phone during the long subway rides between work and home. The rejection email that had arrived earlier that evening had been from Meridian Music Group, the fourth record label to pass on the demo CD she had spent 6 months saving money to produce professionally. The email had been polite but devastating. While we appreciate your submission, your musical style doesn't align with our current roster needs. We wish you the best of luck in your artistic endeavors. Each rejection felt like confirmation of a fear that had been growing stronger with every passing month, that her music was too unusual, too personal, too uncommercial to ever find an audience beyond the empty spaces where she practiced in solitude. Tonight's subway performance had been her way of reminding herself that music mattered even when no one was listening, that the act of creation itself held value independent of recognition or commercial success. But as she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave Platform 7, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the atmosphere around her. Marcus remained motionless behind the maintenance pillar, his body still pressed against the concrete, as if the physical contact with the wall could anchor him to reality. Hearing Zara's voice had awakened something in him that had been dormant since the collapse of his career. A recognition of authentic artistry that bypassed all the cynical calculations that had governed his professional life. The melody she had sung contained fragments of musical DNA that felt both familiar and revolutionary. There were echoes of Nina Simone's fearless vulnerability, traces of Lauryn Hill's genre-defying creativity, hints of Solange's atmospheric innovation. But underneath all these influences lived something entirely original, a musical voice that seemed to emerge from a place of such genuine emotion that it made the carefully manufactured pop music he had been producing for years feel hollow by comparison. Marcus Chen had not always been the calculating industry executive who had ultimately destroyed Elena Rodriguez's trust. 25 years earlier, he had been a first-generation Chinese-American college student who spent his evenings in Berkeley coffee shops, discovering artists who performed for tips and gas money. His ear for talent had been intuitive then, uncompromised by market research and demographic analysis. His parents had immigrated to San Francisco in the 1970s, opening a small restaurant in Chinatown, where they worked 16-hour days to provide their son with opportunities they had never imagined for themselves. Marcus had been expected to become a doctor or lawyer, to pursue the kind of stable professional success that would justify their sacrifices. But music had claimed him during his sophomore year at UC Berkeley, when he had stumbled into a student radio station and discovered the intoxicating power of introducing audiences to artists they had never heard before. He had started as a late-night DJ, playing experimental jazz and underground hip-hop for an audience of insomniacs and fellow music obsessives. His ability to identify talent before it became commercially viable had attracted the attention of industry scouts, and by his mid-20s, Marcus had been hired as an A&R representative for a small independent label. His success rate had been unprecedented. Every artist he signed had gone on to achieve both critical acclaim and commercial success. The trajectory of his career had been meteoric. Within a decade, he had founded Apex Records and established himself as one of the most influential tastemakers in the industry. His roster had included artists who had redefined entire genres, musicians who had used their platforms to address social justice issues, songwriters who had created the soundtracks for a generation's most important moments. But success in the music industry required a particular kind of hardness, a willingness to make decisions based on market potential rather than artistic merit. Marcus had gradually learned to suppress his emotional responses to music, to evaluate songs based on their commercial viability rather than their ability to move him. The transformation had been so gradual that he hadn't noticed it happening until it was too late. By the time he met Elena Rodriguez, his relationship with music had become entirely transactional. He had forgotten how to simply listen without calculating, how to appreciate art without immediately considering its marketing potential. Elena's music had briefly awakened his dormant passion for authentic artistry, but his approach to developing her career had been corrupted by years of treating artists as products to be shaped and positioned. He had been so focused on crafting her image that he had lost sight of the person behind the music. The night Elena had walked out of the recording studio, Marcus had experienced a moment of terrible clarity. He had seen himself through her eyes, a middle-aged executive who had become so disconnected from his own emotions that he could no longer distinguish between supporting an artist and controlling them. The industry backlash that followed had been swift and comprehensive, but the professional consequences had been nothing compared to the personal reckoning that had consumed the past 2 years. Marcus had been forced to confront the reality that his success had been built on a foundation of emotional manipulation and creative exploitation. He had liquidated Apex Records and retreated from public life, spending his days in therapy sessions, and his nights wandering the city like a ghost, haunting the scenes of his former triumphs. The penthouse apartment that had once hosted industry parties now felt like a mausoleum, filled with platinum albums and industry awards that had lost all meaning. Tonight, listening to Zara's voice in the subway tunnel, Marcus had felt something he hadn't experienced in years, pure aesthetic pleasure, uncomplicated by commercial considerations. Her music had reminded him of the person he had been before success had corrupted his relationship with art. As Zara's footsteps began to fade into the distance, Marcus faced a choice that would determine whether he remained trapped in the prison of his past mistakes or found the courage to risk vulnerability again. He could let this moment pass, allow this extraordinary voice to disappear back into the city's anonymous masses, or he could step out of the shadows and confront the possibility that redemption might require him to become someone entirely different from the man he had been. But approaching Zara would mean revealing himself as the disgraced industry executive whose name had become synonymous with creative exploitation. It would mean admitting that he had been hiding in subway tunnels like a fugitive from his own reputation. Most terrifyingly, it would mean acknowledging that despite everything he had lost, he still believed in the transformative power of authentic music. The decision hung in the air like Zara's last note, suspended between fear and possibility, between the safety of continued exile and the terrifying prospect of attempting to rebuild something beautiful from the wreckage of everything he had destroyed. Marcus waited until Zara's footsteps completely disappeared before emerging from behind the maintenance pillar, his legs unsteady from standing motionless for so long. The subway platform felt different now, charged with the residual energy of her performance, as if the concrete walls had absorbed something precious and were reluctant to let it dissipate back into the city's ambient noise. He walked slowly to the spot where she had been standing, noting the scuff marks her sneakers had left on the dusty floor, the way she had positioned herself to take advantage of the platform's natural acoustics. Everything about her performance had demonstrated an intuitive understanding of space and sound that couldn't be taught in any conservatory. The melody she had sung continued to loop through his consciousness, each repetition revealing new layers of complexity he hadn't noticed during the live performance. There had been a bridge section that shifted from major to minor key in a way that suggested formal musical training. But the emotional phrasing had been entirely instinctual, unpolished by the kind of professional coaching that often smoothed away an artist's most distinctive characteristics. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened his voice memo app, humming fragments of what he could remember from Zara's song. His pitch was imperfect and his timing uncertain, but he needed to capture something before the memory began to fade. As he recorded, he realized he was trying to preserve not just the melody, but the feeling of witnessing something completely authentic in a world that had taught him to doubt the existence of such moments. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself returning to Platform 7 with the obsessive regularity of someone conducting a scientific experiment. He arrived at different times, approaching from various directions, trying to map the patterns of Zara's appearances without making his presence obvious or intrusive. He learned that she came to the platform roughly 3 times per week, always after midnight, always carrying the same worn leather satchel. Her performances lasted between 15 and 30 minutes, depending on whether she was working through new material or refining songs she had been developing over time. She never sang the same song twice in exactly the same way, treating each performance as an opportunity for discovery rather than repetition. Marcus began to understand that these subway sessions were Zara's laboratory, the place where she tested emotional hypotheses and explored the boundaries of her artistic voice. He watched her experiment with different vocal techniques, sometimes whispering so quietly he had to strain to hear her, other times allowing her voice to fill the entire platform with sound that seemed to emerge from someplace deeper than her throat. Through careful observation, he started to piece together fragments of her routine and circumstances. The hospital ID badge that occasionally fell from her satchel suggested she worked in healthcare. The textbooks she sometimes carried indicated she was pursuing some form of continuing education. The way she checked her phone anxiously between songs revealed someone balancing multiple responsibilities and chronic exhaustion. But it was her music that told the most complete story. Her lyrics spoke of night shift loneliness, of dreams deferred but not abandoned, of finding beauty in industrial fluorescent lighting and the rhythm of urban machinery. She sang about family expectations and personal ambitions, about the weight of carrying other people's hopes while struggling to nurture her own. One Tuesday night in early November, Marcus arrived at Platform 7 to discover that Zara had beaten him there and was already deep into a song he hadn't heard before. This one was more complex than her usual compositions, featuring intricate vocal harmonies she created by layering different melodic lines on top of each other. She was using her phone to record backing tracks, then singing along to create elaborate arrangements that transformed the empty subway platform into a makeshift recording studio. The song was about transformation, about the space between who you are and who you're becoming, about the courage required to reinvent yourself when the world insists on keeping you in the same category forever. As Marcus listened, he realized she was articulating something he had been trying to understand about his own life for the past 2 years. The lyrics contained lines that felt like personal revelations. They told me I was background music, but I've been writing symphonies in my sleep, and every rejection letter is just another page in the story I'm still writing. Her voice carried a defiance that wasn't angry but determined, a refusal to accept other people's limitations as the boundaries of her own possibilities. Marcus found himself taking notes on his phone, not about commercial potential or market positioning, but about the emotional architecture of her songs. He documented the way she used silence as punctuation, how she built tension through repetition, the manner in which she could make a simple chord progression feel revolutionary through the specificity of her emotional delivery. Without realizing it, he was rediscovering his original relationship with music, the pure, analytical joy of understanding how great art achieved its effects. For the first time in years, he was studying songs because they moved him rather than because they might generate revenue. Meanwhile, Zara remained unaware that her private artistic laboratory had acquired an audience. The subway platform continued to feel like her secret sanctuary, the one place in the city where she could experiment without judgment or external pressure. Her day job at Mount Sinai had become increasingly demanding as the hospital implemented new efficiency protocols that required her to process more laundry in less time, leaving her exhausted by the end of each shift. The rejection letters from Record labels had continued to arrive with discouraging regularity. Pinnacle Entertainment had passed because her sound was too experimental for mainstream radio. Velocity Records had declined because her music lacked the commercial appeal necessary for our current market strategy. Each rejection felt like confirmation that there was no place in the professional music industry for the kind of emotional honesty she was determined to maintain. But the subway performances had become increasingly important to her creative development. She was learning to trust her instincts about arrangement and phrasing, discovering vocal techniques she never would have attempted in a formal recording environment. The acoustics of the platform were teaching her about the relationship between space and sound, how different emotional intentions required different approaches to projection and resonance. During her November 8th session, Zara debuted a song that represented a significant evolution in her compositional style, called Underground Frequencies. It was a meditation on finding your authentic voice in a world designed to make you invisible. The melody incorporated polyrhythmic elements from her African heritage, while the harmonic structure drew from jazz traditions she had been studying during her lunch breaks at work. Marcus recognized immediately that this was the most sophisticated piece he had heard her perform. The song demonstrated technical skills that suggested formal training combined with an emotional maturity that couldn't be taught. More importantly, it revealed an artist who was developing her own aesthetic language rather than imitating existing commercial templates. As Zara sang the bridge section, a complex passage that required her to shift between 3 different vocal registers while maintaining perfect pitch, Marcus realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in his experience. This was an artist developing in complete isolation from industry influence, creating music based purely on internal artistic imperatives rather than external market demands. The recognition carried both excitement and terror. Marcus understood that Zara represented exactly the kind of authentic artistry the music industry desperately needed, but he also knew that his own reputation would make it impossible for him to approach her directly. Any connection between them would inevitably be interpreted through the lens of his history with Elena Rodriguez, turning what should be a celebration of artistic discovery into another story about industry exploitation. But watching Zara perform in the subway tunnel, Marcus began to formulate a different kind of plan. Instead of approaching her as Marcus Chen, former CEO of Apex Records, he could find a way to support her development without revealing his identity. He could become the kind of mentor he wished he had been for Elena, someone who facilitated artistic growth without demanding creative control. The logistics would be complicated, but Marcus had learned during his 2 years of exile that anonymity could be a powerful tool for authentic connection. In the subway tunnels, stripped of his professional credentials and industry connections, he had rediscovered his original passion for music. Perhaps that same anonymity could allow him to help Zara without corrupting her artistic development, with the baggage of his reputation. As Zara finished Underground Frequencies and began packing up her equipment, Marcus made a decision that would determine whether his encounter with authentic artistry would remain a passive observation or become an active attempt at redemption. He would find a way to support her music without revealing himself, to become the kind of advocate she deserved rather than the kind of manipulator he had been. The challenge would be approaching her in a way that felt genuine rather than calculated, helpful rather than controlling. Marcus knew that his entire future relationship with music would be determined by whether he could learn to nurture artistic development without needing to possess or direct it. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later through an act of accidental courage that neither Marcus nor Zara had planned. On a particularly cold December evening, when the subway platform felt more like a refrigerator than a performance space, Zara's usual routine was disrupted by circumstances beyond her control. She had arrived at platform 7 later than usual, delayed by a crisis at the hospital that had required her to work an extra 2 hours when one of the industrial washing machines had broken down and flooded the entire laundry facility. Her supervisor had asked her to stay late to help salvage the soaked linens and reset the equipment, which meant she didn't reach the subway station until nearly 2:30 a.m. The additional work had left her emotionally drained and physically exhausted, but she had been developing a new song for the past week, a piece about resilience in the face of repeated disappointment, and she needed to work through the final verse before the melody slipped away from her memory. Marcus had been waiting on platform 7 since midnight, having adjusted his schedule to account for Zara's typical arrival patterns. The extended delay had given him time to think about the plan he had been developing, a way to make contact that would feel natural rather than contrived. He had been carrying a small notebook for the past month, one that he filled with observations about music theory and composition techniques. His idea was to accidentally leave the notebook behind after one of Zara's performances, positioned where she would be likely to find it. The notebook contained genuine insights about songwriting and arrangement, along with encouraging notes about the power of authentic artistic expression. If she found it intriguing enough to investigate further, perhaps it could serve as the foundation for an anonymous correspondence about music. But when Zara finally appeared on the platform, everything about her demeanor suggested someone operating at the edge of emotional capacity. Her usual careful preparation ritual was abbreviated and distracted. She seemed to be fighting back tears as she set up her phone to record, and her first attempts to begin singing were interrupted by the kind of exhausted sobs that emerge when someone has been holding themselves together through sheer willpower. For too long, Marcus watched from his hiding place as Zara struggled to find her emotional center, starting and stopping the same song multiple times as her voice cracked with fatigue and frustration. It was clear that tonight's session wasn't going to follow her usual pattern of controlled artistic exploration. After her fourth false start, Zara sat down heavily on the platform's single concrete bench and buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with the kind of silent crying that happens when someone is too tired to make noise, but too overwhelmed to stop the tears from coming. Marcus found himself faced with a choice that demanded immediate action rather than careful planning. He could maintain his hidden position and wait for her to recover, preserving the anonymity that had allowed him to observe her development for the past month. Or he could abandon his elaborate schemes and simply respond to another human being who was clearly in distress. The decision made itself. Marcus stepped out from behind the maintenance pillar, moving slowly enough to avoid startling her, but deliberately enough to make his presence known. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "Are you all right?" Zara looked up, her eyes wide with surprise and embarrassment. She quickly wiped her face with her sleeve and stood up, instinctively reaching for her satchel as if preparing to flee. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was thick with tears and exhaustion. I didn't realize anyone else was down here." Marcus kept his distance, sensing that any sudden movement might cause her to bolt. "I work late shifts sometimes," he said, which was technically true, even if misleading about the nature of his work. "I heard you singing, and I just wanted to make sure you were okay." The lie felt necessary, a way to acknowledge their connection without revealing the extent of his surveillance. He studied her face in the dim, fluorescent lighting, seeing clearly for the first time the person whose voice had been haunting his thoughts for weeks. Zara was younger than he had estimated, probably in her early 20s, with intelligent eyes that held a mixture of wariness and curiosity. Her exhaustion was evident in the way she held her shoulders, but there was something in her posture that suggested resilience rather than defeat. "You heard me singing?" she asked, and Marcus could hear both vulnerability and pride in the question. "I did," Marcus replied. "You have an extraordinary voice." The compliment seemed to catch her off guard. She had been expecting judgment or criticism, not appreciation from a stranger in a subway tunnel. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I use this place to practice. It's the only spot I've found where the acoustics are good and no one can hear me." Marcus realized this was the crucial moment that would determine whether their interaction became a genuine conversation or an awkward encounter that sent her fleeing to find a new secret practice space. "Well, technically someone can hear you," he said with a gentle smile, "but I promise I'm not here to disturb your practice. I'm just a fellow insomniac who appreciates good music." Something in his tone must have convinced her that he wasn't a threat, because Zara's defensive posture began to relax slightly. "What kind of work keeps you up this late?" she asked. Marcus had prepared for this question, knowing that any future interaction would require a plausible explanation for his presence in the subway tunnels. "I'm a freelance music researcher," he said, which was close enough to the truth that it didn't feel entirely dishonest. "I study acoustic properties of different performance spaces. Subway stations have unique sound characteristics that you can't replicate in traditional venues." The explanation seemed to satisfy her curiosity while also establishing a connection to music that felt natural rather than forced. "That's actually really interesting," Zara said, and Marcus could hear genuine enthusiasm breaking through her. "Exhaustion. I've been learning so much about sound just by experimenting down here. The way my voice carries depends on where I stand, and the echo patterns change depending on whether I'm facing the tunnel or the platform." Marcus felt a surge of excitement at her technical observations. This was exactly the kind of intuitive understanding of acoustics that separated naturally gifted performers from those who relied purely on formal training. "Have you noticed how the concrete affects different frequency ranges?" he asked, genuinely curious about her discoveries. "Yes." Zara's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found another person interested in the technical aspects of her obsession. "The lower registers get absorbed really quickly, but the higher frequencies bounce around for several seconds. It means I have to adjust my phrasing depending on whether I'm singing melody or harmony lines." For the next 20 minutes, they stood on the platform discussing the acoustic properties of subway tunnels, the relationship between architectural, design, and musical performance, and the ways that different emotional intentions required different approaches to vocal projection. Marcus was careful to frame his extensive knowledge as the result of academic research rather than industry experience, but Zara's questions and observations revealed a sophisticated understanding of sound that impressed him more than any conservatory training could have. "I should probably let you get back to your practice," Marcus finally said, sensing that Zara was beginning to relax into their conversation, but not wanting to overstay his welcome during their first interaction. "Actually," Zara said, surprising herself with her boldness, "would you mind listening to something I've been working on? I could use an objective opinion from someone who understands acoustics." Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate. This was the opportunity he had been hoping for, but it was happening much sooner and more naturally than any of his elaborate plans had anticipated. "I'd be honored," he said, meaning it completely. Zara returned to her usual performance position and pulled out her phone. "This song is called Frequency Match," she explained. "It's about finding people who understand your wavelength, even when you're broadcasting on frequencies that most people can't hear." As she began to sing, Marcus realized that the song was, in many ways, about exactly what was happening between them in that moment. Two people who had been operating on similar emotional frequencies had finally found a way to make contact across the static of their individual isolation. The melody was more complex than anything he had heard her perform before, featuring harmonic progressions that demonstrated both technical sophistication and emotional intelligence. But more importantly, her delivery had gained confidence from having an audience that was listening with genuine appreciation rather than commercial calculation. When she finished, Marcus applauded softly, the sound echoing off the concrete walls, like a series of small celebrations. "That was remarkable," he said. "The way you used the natural reverb in the bridge section was particularly effective. It created an emotional depth that wouldn't have been possible in a traditional studio setting." Zara beamed with the satisfaction of being understood by someone who could appreciate the technical choices behind her artistic decisions. "Thank you," she said. "That means more to me than you might realize." As they prepared to part ways, Marcus felt the weight of possibilities and dangers that lay ahead. He had successfully made contact with Zara without revealing his identity, but maintaining this connection would require increasingly complex deceptions. Every conversation would demand careful management of information. Every interaction would need to be calibrated to avoid exposure. But watching Zara pack up her equipment with renewed energy, seeing the way their conversation had transformed, her exhausted despair into excited engagement, Marcus knew that the risk was worth taking. For the first time in 2 years, he had participated in a genuine discussion about music without any agenda beyond mutual appreciation. The challenge now would be finding a way to nurture this connection without allowing it to become another story about industry manipulation disguised as artistic support. The unraveling began 6 weeks later on a Tuesday evening that started like any other, but ended with the kind of recognition that changes everything irreversibly. Zara had been looking forward to her subway session all day, eager to share a breakthrough she had experienced with a song that had been challenging her for months. Their meetings had evolved into a regular occurrence, though always presented as chance encounters rather than planned appointments. Marcus would arrive at Platform 7 under the pretense of conducting acoustic research, while Zara would appear for her usual practice sessions. The timing had become synchronized through a series of seemingly natural adjustments, Zara mentioning that she typically practiced on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, Marcus casually revealing that his research schedule aligned perfectly with those same nights. Over the past month and a half, their conversations had deepened beyond technical discussions of acoustics and vocal technique. Marcus had learned about Zara's nursing studies, her family's immigration story, and her struggle to balance artistic ambitions with financial necessities. She had shared her collection of rejection letters from record labels, reading them aloud, with a mixture of disappointment and defiant humor that reminded Marcus of his own early career frustrations. In return, Marcus had crafted a carefully constructed persona as David Chen, a freelance music researcher and part-time composition teacher, who spent his nights studying unconventional performance spaces. The identity felt both authentic and fictional, authentic because it represented who he might have become if his career had taken a different path, fictional because it omitted the entire trajectory that had defined his actual professional life. He had been careful to demonstrate knowledge that seemed consistent with academic study rather than industry experience. When Zara asked about recording techniques, he framed his expertise in terms of theoretical research rather than hands-on production work. When she sought advice about song arrangements, he presented his suggestions as educated guesses rather than informed recommendations. The deception had become increasingly complicated as their relationship deepened, but Marcus convinced himself that the lies were justified by the authenticity of their musical connection. Zara's artistic development had accelerated dramatically since they began their conversations. Her compositions had grown more sophisticated, her vocal technique had gained confidence, and her understanding of musical theory had expanded through their collaborative discussions. Most importantly, she had begun to believe in herself as an artist rather than simply dreaming about becoming one. Marcus watched her transform from someone who sang apologetically in empty subway tunnels to someone who owned her voice and trusted her creative instincts. On this particular Tuesday evening, Zara arrived at Platform 7 carrying more than her usual equipment. Along with her satchel and phone, she had brought a small portable speaker and what appeared to be a professionally printed folder. "David!" she called out when she spotted Marcus emerging from the service corridor. Their greetings had become warm and familiar, like old friends who happened to share an unusual hobby. "You seem excited about something," Marcus observed, noting the energy in her movement and the brightness in her eyes. "I have news," Zara said, setting down her equipment with unusual care. "Remember that song I've been working on, the one about finding your authentic voice? I finally recorded a proper demo of it last week." Marcus felt a flutter of anxiety mixed with pride. He'd been instrumental in helping her develop that particular composition, suggesting harmonic progressions and arrangement ideas during their previous sessions. Hearing that she had taken it to the next level filled him with vicarious satisfaction, but it also raised questions about what she planned to do with the recording. "That's wonderful," he said. "How did it turn out?" "Better than I hoped," Zara replied, pulling a CD from the professional folder. "I saved up money to use a real recording studio for 4 hours. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely different from singing down here, but I think I captured something important." She held up the CD, which bore a simple handwritten label, "Underground Frequencies, Zara Okafor Demo 2024. Marcus stared at the disc, recognizing the significance of what she was showing him. This represented her first serious attempt to professionalize her music, to take the songs they had developed together during their subway sessions and present them to the industry he had spent 2 years trying to forget. "I actually submitted it to 3 different record labels," Zara continued, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "I know the chances are slim, but after all our conversations about authenticity and artistic integrity, I felt ready to take the risk." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Zara had used the confidence he had helped her develop to submit music to the same industry that had destroyed his reputation. She was entering a world he knew intimately but couldn't warn her about. Without revealing his identity, "Which labels?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the panic rising in his chest. "Meridian Music Group, Velocity Records, and Apex Records," Zara said. "I did some research and these seemed like companies that might appreciate more experimental music." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Apex Records, his former company, the label he had liquidated in shame 2 years earlier, no longer existed. But Meridian and Velocity were both companies run by his former competitors, executives who would recognize his artistic fingerprints on any music he had influenced. "Have you heard back from any of them yet?" Marcus asked, his mouth suddenly dry. "Actually, yes," Zara said, her excitement building. "Meridian responded yesterday. They want to meet with me next week to discuss a potential development deal." The words hit Marcus like a series of hammer blows. Meridian Music Group was run by Patricia Wells, a former colleague who had been particularly vocal in condemning Marcus during the industry backlash following the Elena Rodriguez incident. If Patricia heard Zara's music and recognized Marcus's influence on the arrangements, the meeting would become an interrogation about their connection. That's incredible news, Marcus managed to say, though his enthusiasm sounded forced, even to his own ears. Zara noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. "You don't seem happy about it," she said, her excitement fading into concern. "Is there something I should know about Meridian? I thought you'd be excited for me." Marcus realized he was facing the moment he had been dreading since their first conversation. He could continue the deception and allow Zara to walk into a meeting that might expose both of them, or he could find a way to warn her without revealing the full truth about his identity. "The music industry can be complicated," he said carefully. "Sometimes what seems like an opportunity can become something else entirely." "What do you mean?" Zara asked, and Marcus could hear suspicion creeping into her voice. Before he could formulate a response that balanced honesty with self-preservation, the sound of footsteps echoed from the main platform area. Both Marcus and Zara turned toward the noise, expecting to see a maintenance worker or security guard who might force them to relocate their conversation. Instead, a figure emerged from the shadows of the tunnel entrance, a woman in an expensive coat carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of confident expression that suggested someone accustomed to being in charge of important situations. Marcus recognized her immediately, though she looked older than he remembered and more tired than her public appearances usually suggested. Patricia Wells, CEO of Meridian Music Group, was standing 20 feet away from them, studying Zara with the analytical intensity of someone conducting an impromptu audition. "Ms. Okafor," Patricia said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to making pronouncements rather than starting conversations. "I was hoping I might find you here." Zara stared at the woman in confusion, clearly trying to process how a record label executive had managed to locate her secret practice. "Space. I'm sorry," Zara said. "How did you know where to find me? We don't have a meeting scheduled until next week." Patricia smiled, but there was something predatory in the expression. "Your demo was quite impressive," she said, "but there were certain elements in the arrangements that seemed familiar. I decided to do some research into your background and discovered that you work at Mount Sinai Hospital. From there, it wasn't difficult to track your commute patterns and identify your usual haunts." Marcus felt his entire body go cold as he realized what was happening. Patricia hadn't come to offer Zara a recording contract. She had come to investigate a suspicion about who might be influencing her music. "The arrangements on your demo show a level of sophistication that's unusual for an independent artist," Patricia continued, her gaze shifting to Marcus for the first time. "Particularly the harmonic progressions in underground frequencies. Those chord changes are remarkably similar to techniques that were pioneered by a former colleague of mine." Zara looked back and forth between Patricia and Marcus, beginning to understand that something significant was happening, but not yet grasping the full implications. "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting," Zara said. Patricia's smile became sharper. "I'm suggesting that someone with extensive industry experience has been helping you develop your sound. Someone who might have reasons for wanting to remain anonymous." She turned to face Marcus directly. "Hello, Marcus," she said. "I wondered when you might try to resurface." The recognition hit Zara like a physical shock. She stared at Marcus, at David, at the person she had trusted with her music and her dreams, as the carefully constructed fiction of their relationship collapsed around them. "Marcus," she whispered, and the betrayal in her voice was more devastating than any industry controversy he had ever faced. The silence that followed Patricia's revelation stretched across Platform 7 like a chasm that had suddenly opened in the concrete floor. Zara stood frozen, her eyes moving between Marcus and Patricia as if trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces had just been scattered by an earthquake. "Marcus Chen," Patricia continued, her voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone who had just confirmed a long-held suspicion. Former CEO of Apex Records, the man who destroyed Elena Rodriguez's career and disappeared from the industry 2 years ago in disgrace. Each word hit Zara like a separate blow. Marcus, not David, but Marcus Chen, a name she now remembered from music industry articles she had read during her research. The executive who had been accused of manipulation and creative exploitation. The man whose downfall had been so complete that even casual music fans knew his story. "Zara," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, "please let me explain." But Zara had taken a step backward, her hands trembling as she processed the magnitude of the deception. Everything they had shared, every conversation about artistic integrity, every moment of connection over their mutual love of authentic music, had been built on a foundation of lies. "You're Marcus Chen," she said, and it wasn't a question, but an accusation. "You've been lying to me this entire time." Patricia watched the exchange with the detached interest of someone observing a psychological experiment. "I have to admit, Marcus, I'm impressed by the creativity of your approach. Lurking in subway tunnels, pretending to be a freelance researcher, it's certainly more subtle than your previous methods." Marcus felt something inside him break as he watched Zara's face cycle through confusion, betrayal, and finally a kind of cold understanding that was worse than anger. "It wasn't like that," he said desperately. "I never meant to deceive you. I was here by accident the first night I heard you sing. Everything that happened afterward happened because you planned it," Zara finished, her voice gaining strength as her shock transformed into fury. "You've been manipulating me just like you manipulated Elena Rodriguez." The comparison to Elena hit Marcus harder than any professional criticism ever had. He could see in Zara's eyes the same loss of trust that had characterized Elena's final interview, the same devastating realization that someone she had believed in had been using her for purposes she hadn't understood. "No," Marcus said, stepping toward her. "What happened with Elena was different. I was different then. With you, You what?" Zara demanded. "You decided to try a more sophisticated approach? You thought if you pretended to be someone else, you could avoid the messy complications of honest relationships." Patricia cleared her throat, drawing their attention back to her presence. "This is all very touching," she said. "But I didn't come here for a therapy session. Ms. Okafor, I think you should know exactly who you've been taking artistic advice from." She pulled out her tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be prepared research materials. Marcus Chen built his reputation by identifying talented artists and then systematically erasing their creative autonomy. Patricia continued, reading from her notes with the clinical precision of someone delivering a legal brief. Elena Rodriguez was the most famous case, but there were others. Artists who signed with Apex Records often found their original material significantly altered during production, their creative input dismissed, their artistic visions subordinated to Marcus's commercial calculations. Marcus wanted to defend himself, to explain the complex pressures that had shaped his decision-making during those years, but every word Patricia spoke contained enough truth to make denial impossible. The industry consensus, Patricia continued, was that Marcus had become so disconnected from his own emotional relationship with music that he could no longer distinguish between supporting artists and controlling them. Zara had been listening to this recitation with growing horror, not just at what Marcus had done to other artists, but at what he might have been doing to her without her knowledge. "Is that what you were doing with me?" she asked, her voice quiet but deadly serious. "Were you using me to test some new approach to artist development?" "No," Marcus said, and the desperation in his voice was completely genuine. "Zara, you have to believe me. Everything I felt about your music was real. Every conversation we Had about authenticity and artistic integrity. I meant every word, but you were lying about who you were, Zara replied. How am I supposed to separate what was real from what was manipulation? Patricia interjected before Marcus could respond. Ms. Okafor, I think you should also know that the arrangements on your demo show clear signs of Marcus's influence. The harmonic progressions, the vocal layering techniques, even the structural approach to bridge sections, these are all signature elements of his production style. The revelation hit Zara like a physical blow. She had been so proud of her artistic growth over the past months, so excited about the sophistication her music had gained through her collaboration with David, with Marcus. Now she was being told that her evolution as an artist had been guided by the same manipulative tendencies that had destroyed Elena Rodriguez's trust in her own creative instincts. Was any of it mine? Zara asked, her voice breaking. Did I actually grow as an artist, or was I just being molded into another one of your projects? Marcus felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as he watched Zara question everything she had accomplished during their time together. This was exactly what he had hoped to avoid, the poisoning of her artistic confidence by the toxicity of his reputation. Your voice was always yours, he said urgently. Your melodies, your lyrics, your emotional instincts, none of that came from me. I just helped you understand how to present what was already there, like you helped Elena Rodriguez. Zara shot back. The comparison silenced Marcus completely. He couldn't deny that his relationship with Elena had begun with similar good intentions, similar beliefs that he was simply helping a talented artist reach her potential. The fact that his work with Zara felt different to him didn't change the pattern Patricia was identifying. Ms. Okafor, Patricia said, her tone becoming more professional, I want you to know that Meridian's interest in your music isn't dependent on any connection to Marcus Chen. Your vocal ability and songwriting instincts are genuinely impressive. However, I'm concerned about the extent to which your recent development has been influenced by someone with his history. Zara looked at Patricia with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you might benefit from working with producers and arrangers who don't have a track record of creative exploitation, Patricia replied. Meridian has resources that could help you develop your authentic voice without the complications that seem to follow Marcus wherever he goes. Marcus realized that he was watching Zara's future being negotiated by people who viewed her primarily as a business opportunity. Patricia's offer sounded generous, but he recognized the underlying calculation. Meridian would gain credibility by rescuing an artist from his influence, while simultaneously denying him any connection to Zara's future success. Zara, Marcus said, his voice cutting through Patricia's pitch, whatever you decide about your career, please don't let what you've learned about me make you doubt your own abilities. Everything you've accomplished as an artist, that's yours. I may have offered suggestions about arrangements, but your talent, your emotional honesty, your unique musical voice, none of that came from me. Zara stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus could see her trying to separate her anger about his deception from her uncertainty about her own artistic development. How am I supposed to know what's mine and what's yours? She asked. How am I supposed to trust my own instincts when they've been shaped by someone who lies about who he is? The question hung in the air like an indictment, not just of Marcus's deception, but of the entire relationship between mentorship and manipulation in the music industry. Patricia sensed an opportunity in Zara's confusion. This is exactly why Meridian's development program could be valuable for you, she said. We could help you separate your authentic artistic voice from any external influences, help you develop confidence in your own creative instincts. Marcus, Watch Patricia position herself as Zara's rescuer, offering to solve problems that his presence had created. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being replaced by another industry executive who would inevitably shape Zara's artistic development, according to her own commercial priorities. "I need time to think," Zara said finally, her voice exhausted by the emotional weight of the revelations. About all of this. She began gathering her equipment with mechanical precision, avoiding eye contact with both Marcus and Patricia. "Of course," Patricia said. "Take all the time you need, but don't wait too long. Opportunities like this have a way of evaporating if you don't act decisively." As Zara packed up her phone and speaker, Marcus realized that this might be the last time he ever saw her. Their entire relationship had been built on a lie that had now been exposed, and there was no reason for her to trust anything he might say in the future. "Zara," he said as she prepared to leave, "I know you have no reason to believe me, but I want you to know that hearing your music changed something fundamental in me. For the first time in years, I remembered why I fell in love with art in the first place. That wasn't manipulation, that was salvation." Zara paused at the edge of the platform, her back still turned to him. "The problem is," she said without turning around, "I'll never know if that's true, or if it's just another story you're telling to make yourself feel better about what you've done." She walked away without looking back, leaving Marcus alone with Patricia in the subway tunnel that had been his sanctuary and was now the scene of his latest destruction. Patricia watched Zara disappear into the darkness before turning back to Marcus with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with personal contempt. "You know," she said, "I actually thought you might have learned something from the Elena Rodriguez situation, but here you are, 2 years later, still manipulating talented artists while pretending to be their friend." Marcus stood in the empty subway station, surrounded by the echoes of Zara's footsteps and the weight of his own repeated failures, finally understanding that redemption might require more than good intentions and anonymous gestures. The weeks following the confrontation on Platform 7 passed like a fever dream of regret and desperate introspection. Marcus found himself unable to return to the subway station, unable to face the space where he had experienced both the purest joy and most devastating shame of his adult life. Instead, he wandered the streets of Manhattan at all hours, a ghost, haunting the city that had once celebrated his professional achievements. His Tribeca apartment, which had felt like a museum during his 2 years of exile, now seemed like a mausoleum. The platinum albums on his walls mocked him with memories of artists whose careers he had shaped and sometimes destroyed. The industry awards gathering dust on his shelves reminded him of a time when he had believed that commercial success and artistic integrity could coexist without compromise, but it was the silence that tormented him most. For months, his nights had been filled with the anticipation of hearing Zara's voice, the excitement of discovering what new song she might debut or how she might evolve a composition they had discussed during their previous encounter. Now, the absence of her music felt like a physical wound that refused to heal. Marcus had tried to research what had happened to Zara after their confrontation, but his industry connections had been severed so completely that he had no way to gather reliable information. He didn't know if she had signed with Meridian Music Group, if she had continued developing her music independently, or if the trauma of discovering his deception had caused her to abandon her artistic ambitions entirely. The uncertainty was unbearable, but it was also justified. He had forfeited any right to know about Zara's future when he had chosen deception over honesty, when he had prioritized his own emotional needs over her right to make informed decisions about their relationship. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Marcus made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He would visit Elena Rodriguez and attempt to make the amends he should have offered 2 years earlier, not because he expected forgiveness, but because he finally understood that his pattern of artistic manipulation would continue until he faced the full consequences of what he had done to the person who had trusted him most completely. Elena had moved to Portland after leaving New York, settling in a neighborhood of converted warehouses and independent coffee shops that reminded Marcus of the music scene where he had first discovered his passion for authentic artistry. She was working as a music therapist at a children's hospital, while continuing to write and perform her own music on a much smaller scale than the international stardom Apex Records had been positioning her to achieve. Marcus had found her address through a private investigator, a violation of her privacy that felt consistent with his history of boundary violations, but necessary for the confession he needed to make. He drove from New York to Portland without stopping, propelled by a combination of self-loathing and desperate hope that honesty might finally break the cycle of destruction that had defined his relationships with artists. Elena's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a brick building that had been converted from a textile factory. The hallways smelled of coffee and incense, and the walls were covered with flyers advertising open mic nights and community art projects. It was exactly the kind of environment where authentic creativity could flourish without commercial pressure. The kind of space Marcus had spent his career trying to recreate artificially in expensive recording studios. When Elena opened the door, Marcus was struck by how much more peaceful she looked than during their final confrontations at Apex Records. Her hair was shorter, her style more casual, but her eyes held a clarity that suggested someone who had found her way back to her authentic self after escaping a destructive situation. "Marcus," she said, and her voice carried surprise rather than anger. "I wondered if you would ever show up here." The greeting suggested that she had been expecting this conversation, that some part of her had always known he would eventually need to confront what he had done to her career and her trust. "I came to apologize," Marcus said, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what he needed to express, "and to tell you the truth about things I should have admitted years ago." Elena studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this encounter would be worth the emotional energy it would require. "Come in," she said finally, "but I want you to know that I'm not interested in relitigating the past. If you're here to justify your actions or ask for my forgiveness, this conversation is going to be very short." Elena's apartment was small, but filled with natural light from large windows that overlooked a courtyard where children played music lessons in the afternoon. The walls were covered with instruments, guitars, keyboards, percussion equipment that suggested someone who had rediscovered joy in music making rather than music as a commercial enterprise. They sat across from each other at a small wooden table, and Marcus found himself struggling to begin the conversation he had been rehearsing during the entire drive from New York. "I destroyed your trust in your own artistic instincts," he said finally, "and I did it because I had lost faith in mine." Elena raised an eyebrow at the directness of his confession. "Go on," she said. "When I first heard your demo, it reminded me of why I had fallen in love with music," Marcus continued. "But instead of supporting your vision, I tried to shape it into something that would validate my own artistic theories. I treated you like an experiment rather than a person." "That's true," Elena said without emotion. "But tell me something I don't already know." Marcus took a breath, preparing to reveal the detail that had haunted him most during the past 2 years. "I was in love with you," he said. "Not romantically, but artistically. I was in love with your talent, your authenticity, your ability to create music that moved people without calculation, and instead of celebrating that gift, I tried to possess it." Elena's expression didn't change, but Marcus could see that his admission had surprised her. "I convinced myself that I was helping you reach your potential," he continued, "but what I was really doing was trying to merge your artistic identity with mine. I wanted to be part of your creative process so completely that people wouldn't be able to separate your success from my guidance." "Like a parasite," Elena said quietly. The comparison hit Marcus like a physical blow, but he couldn't deny its accuracy. "Yes," he said, "like a parasite that feeds on authentic creativity because it can no longer generate its own." Elena stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard, where a young girl was learning to play violin with patient instruction from an older woman. "Do you know what the worst part was?" Elena asked without turning around. "It wasn't that you tried to control my music. It was that you made me doubt whether any of my instincts were valid. After I left Apex, I spent months questioning every creative decision I made, wondering if my ideas were actually good, or if I had just been trained to think they were good by someone who was manipulating me." Marcus felt tears beginning to form as he listened to Elena describe exactly the same crisis of artistic confidence he was now watching Zara experience. "How did you get past that?" he asked. Elena turned back to face him. "By starting over completely. I stopped trying to write the kind of songs I thought would impress industry executives and started writing music that helped children process trauma. I discovered that when you create art for people who genuinely need it, rather than people who might profit from it, your authentic voice comes back naturally." She sat back down at the table and studied Marcus's face with the analytical attention of someone who had spent years learning to read emotional subtext. "But you didn't come here just to apologize to me," she said. "Something happened recently that made you realize you were repeating the same pattern with someone else." Marcus was stunned by the accuracy of her observation. Elena had always possessed an intuitive understanding of human psychology that had made her music so emotionally resonant, but seeing that insight directed at him was both impressive and terrifying. "Her name is Zara," Marcus said. "I met her by accident, and I convinced myself that this time would be different, that I could help her develop as an artist without corrupting her creative process." "But you lied to her about who you were," Elena said, "and it wasn't a question. Yes, I thought if she didn't know about my reputation, she could trust my advice without the baggage of what I had done to you and other artists." Elena shook her head with something that might have been sympathy. "Marcus, the problem was never that artists knew too much about your reputation. The problem was that you had lost touch with your own authentic relationship with music. Lying about your identity doesn't solve that. It just creates new forms of manipulation." Marcus realized that Elena had identified the fundamental flaw in his approach to redemption. He had been trying to escape the consequences of his past behavior rather than understanding and changing the psychological patterns that had created that behavior in the first place. "What happened with Zara?" Elena asked. Marcus told her about the months of subway encounters, the gradual development of trust and creative collaboration, and the devastating confrontation with Patricia Wells that had exposed his deception. "So, now she doesn't know what parts of her artistic development were authentic and what parts were influenced by your manipulation," Elena said when he finished. "Yes, and I don't know how to help her separate those things without causing more damage." Elena was quiet for several minutes, and Marcus could see her working through the psychological complexity of the situation. "You can't help her," she said finally. "Any continued involvement from you will only make it harder for her to trust her own instincts. The best thing you can do for Zara is disappear completely and let her rediscover her authentic voice without your influence." The suggestion felt like a death sentence, but Marcus recognized its wisdom. His presence in Zara's life had become a contaminating factor that would prevent her from developing genuine confidence in her own creative abilities. "But there is something you can do," Elena continued. You can make sure she has access to resources that will help her continue developing as an artist without commercial pressure or creative manipulation. Elena walked to her desk and pulled out a business card for a non-profit organization called Creative Sanctuary, which provided grants and mentorship to artists who had been exploited by the commercial music industry. I sit on their advisory board, Elena explained. They specialize in helping artists rebuild their confidence after traumatic experiences with industry executives. Zara would qualify for their program, and they have funding available for independent recording projects and professional development. Marcus studied the business card, realizing that Elena was offering him a way to support Zara's artistic development without corrupting it with his direct involvement. "Would you recommend her for the program?" he asked. "I would," Elena said, "but only if you promise to have no contact with the organization or with Zara ever again. This has to be completely separate from you." Marcus understood that Elena was offering him a path toward genuine redemption, one that required him to prioritize Zara's well-being over his own desire for absolution or continued connection. "I promise," he said, and for the first time in years, he meant it completely. As Marcus prepared to leave Portland, Elena offered him one final piece of wisdom that would determine whether his encounter with Zara became another story of artistic exploitation or the beginning of his genuine transformation. "The reason you keep hurting artists," she said, "is because you're trying to use their creativity to fill something missing in yourself. Until you figure out how to create authentic art again on your own terms, you'll always be a threat to anyone whose talent you admire." 6 months after the confrontation on Platform 7, Zara stood in the recording booth of Creative Sanctuary's non-profit studio in Brooklyn, preparing to lay down vocals for a song that felt more authentically hers than anything she had ever created. The studio was housed in a converted warehouse that had been transformed into a collaborative space for artists who were rebuilding their creative confidence after difficult experiences with the commercial music industry. The months following, her discovery of Marcus's deception had been the most challenging period of her artistic life. She had initially accepted Patricia Wells's offer to work with Meridian Music Group, desperate for validation that her talent was real and separate from Marcus's influence. But the development process at Meridian had felt suffocating in ways that reminded her uncomfortably of the manipulation she was trying to escape. The producers assigned to her project had insisted on changing her melodies to make them more radio-friendly, altering her lyrics to appeal to broader demographic groups, and pressuring her to adopt a more conventional vocal style that would fit existing commercial categories. Within 2 months, Zara had realized that Patricia's version of artistic support was simply a more polished form of the same creative control that Marcus had been accused of exercising. The breaking point had come during a recording session when the lead producer had suggested that Underground Frequencies, the song she was most proud of, needed to be completely restructured to emphasize commercial hooks over emotional complexity. Zara had walked out of the studio that day, forfeiting the development deal and returning to her night shifts at Mount Sinai Hospital with the devastating realization that the music industry might be fundamentally incompatible with the kind of authentic artistry she was determined to create. It was during this period of professional despair that she had received an unexpected phone call from Elena Rodriguez, a name she recognized from the music industry articles she had read while researching Marcus's background. Elena had explained that Creative Sanctuary had received a recommendation for Zara's inclusion in their artist recovery program, though she had been careful not to reveal the source of the recommendation. "We work with musicians who have experienced creative manipulation or exploitation," Elena had explained during their initial conversation. "Our goal is to help artists rediscover their authentic voice without commercial pressure or outside interference. The SVI program had provided Zara with exactly what she needed most: time, space, and resources to explore her musical identity without anyone trying to shape or direct her creative process. She had been assigned a mentor, a jazz vocalist named Carmen Santos, who had rebuilt her career after escaping a similar situation of industry manipulation. But the mentorship focused on technique and confidence building rather than artistic direction. More importantly, Creative Sanctuary had provided Zara with access to recording equipment and studio time that allowed her to experiment with her sound without the financial pressure that had previously limited her artistic exploration. She had spent 3 months recording demos, testing different arrangements, and gradually learning to trust her own creative instincts again. The song she was recording today, titled Frequency Clear, represented the culmination of that process. It was a composition about finding your authentic voice after it had been contaminated by other people's expectations and manipulations. The melody incorporated elements from her African heritage that she had been afraid to include in her earlier work, fearing they might be too unconventional for commercial success. As Zara listened to the instrumental track through her headphones, she felt a confidence in her artistic choices that had been missing since the night she discovered Marcus's true identity. Every harmony, every rhythmic choice, every emotional inflection had emerged from her own creative instincts rather than external suggestions or influences. "Take your time," Carmen said through the studio intercom. "Remember, this is your song. Trust what you're feeling." Zara closed her eyes and began to sing, her voice carrying a strength and clarity that had developed through months of patient self-discovery. The lyrics spoke about the journey from doubt to certainty, from artistic confusion to creative autonomy. Spent so long listening to voices that weren't mine. Thought I needed permission to trust the music inside, but the frequency was always there. Waiting to be clear, just needed to tune out the static and learn how to hear. As she moved through the verses, Zara felt the same transcendent connection to her music that she had experienced during her best subway performances. But this time, the authenticity wasn't compromised by secrets or hidden agendas. She was completely alone with her art, creating something that belonged entirely to her. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in Portland, Elena Rodriguez was sitting in her apartment reading an email that had arrived that morning from Creative Sanctuary's program director. The message contained updates on several artists in the recovery program, including a detailed report on Zara's progress over the past 6 months. Zara Okafor has shown remarkable growth in artistic confidence and creative autonomy, the report read. Her recent compositions demonstrate sophisticated musical development that appears to be entirely self-directed. She has successfully separated her authentic artistic voice from previous external influences and is ready to begin sharing her work with broader audiences. Eleanor smiled as she read the assessment, feeling satisfaction at knowing that Zara had successfully navigated the same journey of artistic recovery that had once seemed impossible to Elena herself. The program had worked exactly as intended, providing Zara with the support she needed to rebuild her creative confidence without repeating the patterns of manipulation that had damaged both their careers. But Elena's satisfaction was complicated by her knowledge of the man whose recommendation had brought Zara to Creative Sanctuary's attention. Marcus Chen had kept his promise to avoid any contact with the organization or with Zara directly, but Elena had been tracking his movements through mutual contacts in the music industry. According to her sources, Marcus had spent the past 6 months in complete isolation from the music business. He had sold his Tribeca apartment and moved to a small cabin in the Adirondack Mountains, where he was reportedly attempting to write music for the first time in over a decade. The reports suggested someone who was finally trying to address the fundamental disconnection from his own creativity that had driven his pattern of artistic parasitism. Elena had mixed feelings about Marcus's apparent transformation. Part of her was skeptical that someone with such a long history of manipulation could genuinely change his relationship with music and other artists. But another part of her recognized the courage required to abandon everything familiar and attempt to rebuild an authentic creative practice from scratch. She had been considering whether to reach out to him, to offer some form of acknowledgement that his recommendation of Zara to Creative Sanctuary had been an act of genuine selflessness rather than sophisticated manipulation. But Elena ultimately decided that maintaining distance was the wisest choice for everyone involved. Back in Brooklyn, Zara was finishing the final vocal takes for Frequency Clear, her voice soaring through the studio with the kind of power that emerges when an artist has complete confidence in their creative choices. Carmen watched through the control room window, recognizing the transformation that occurred when musicians successfully reclaimed their authentic artistic identity. "That was beautiful," Carmen said, as Zara emerged from the recording booth. "You've done something really special in this song." Zara nodded, feeling emotionally drained but artistically fulfilled in a way she hadn't experienced since before her encounter with Marcus. "It feels like the first song I've ever written that's completely mine," she said. "What are you planning to do with it?" Carmen asked. Zara had been considering this question for weeks. The traditional path would involve submitting the recording to record labels or music supervisors, trying to generate industry interest that might lead to commercial opportunities. But her experiences with both Marcus and Meridian Music Group had left her deeply suspicious of any approach that prioritized commercial potential over artistic integrity. "I think I want to release it independently," Zara said. "Maybe start by sharing it online and see if it finds its audience naturally." Carmen nodded approvingly. "That sounds like a decision that's coming from your authentic artistic instincts, rather than external pressure." Over the following weeks, Zara prepared for the independent release of Frequency Clear with the same careful attention she had brought to her subway performances. She created cover art that reflected the song's themes of clarity and authenticity, wrote liner notes that explained her journey from artistic confusion to creative confidence, and planned a release strategy that prioritized artistic community over commercial metrics. The song was uploaded to streaming platforms on a Tuesday evening in late autumn, accompanied by a simple social media post that read, "This is what my voice sounds like when it's completely my own." Within hours, the song had been discovered by music bloggers and independent radio stations that specialized in authentic, uncommercial artistry. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with listeners praising Zara's unique vocal style and the emotional honesty of her composition. But the most meaningful response came from other artists who had experienced similar journeys of creative recovery. Musicians who had escaped manipulative industry relationships began sharing their own stories, creating a community of artists who had chosen artistic integrity over commercial success. As the weeks passed, Frequency Clear gradually gained momentum through word-of-mouth recommendations and organic discovery rather than industry promotion. Zara found herself invited to perform at venues that prioritized artistic authenticity, house concerts, community centers, and independent music festivals where the audience came to experience genuine creativity rather than manufactured entertainment. Success felt different from anything Zara had imagined during her subway platform dreams. Instead of validation from industry executives or commercial radio play, She was receiving recognition from people who understood and appreciated the specific kind of artistic courage her music represented. Most importantly, Zara had learned to measure her success by internal rather than external criteria. She evaluated her artistic growth based on whether her music felt authentic to her own experience rather than whether it impressed people who might advance her career. On a cold December evening, almost exactly 1 year after her first encounter, with Marcus on platform 7, Zara found herself walking through the subway station on her way home from a recording session. Without planning to, she descended to the abandoned platform where she had once practiced in secret, curious to see how the space would feel now that her relationship with her own music had transformed so completely. The platform looked exactly the same. Fluorescent lights flickering against concrete walls, the same acoustic properties that had first taught her about the relationship between space and sound. But standing there as someone who had successfully reclaimed her artistic voice, the space felt smaller and less significant than it had during her months of secret performances. Zara pulled out her phone and recorded a brief voice memo. Not a song, but a simple spoken message. This is where I learned that authentic creativity requires the courage to be completely yourself, even when you think no one is listening. But the most important lesson was learning to trust my own voice even after I discovered that someone was listening who hadn't been honest about who they were. She didn't know if anyone would ever hear the message, but creating it felt like a form of closure, a way of acknowledging how far she had traveled from the frightened young woman who had once left her dreams in subway tunnels because she was afraid to claim them in the light. As Zara walked away from platform 7 for what she suspected might be the last time, she carried with her the knowledge that authentic artistry required not just talent and dedication, but the wisdom to distinguish between support and manipulation, between collaboration and control. Her music had finally become completely her own, and that ownership felt more valuable than any commercial success the industry might have offered in exchange for her creative autonomy. In the mountains of upstate New York, where winter arrived early and stayed late, Marcus Chen sat at a wooden table in the single room of his rented cabin, staring at a blank piece of staff paper that had been mocking him for 3 hours. The silence around him was absolute. No city traffic, no industry phone calls, no distractions from the terrifying prospect of creating something entirely his own for the first time in over 15 years. The cabin was Spartan by design, containing only the essential elements of survival and creation: a bed, a small kitchen, a fireplace, and the upright piano he had bought from a church that was closing down in the nearby town of Lake Placid. The piano was old and slightly out of tune, its keys yellowed with age, but it produced sound with an honesty that his expensive studio equipment had never achieved. Marcus had been living this way for 8 months now, ever since his conversation with Elena Rodriguez had forced him to confront the fundamental truth about his relationship with music. He had become a creative parasite, feeding off other people's authenticity because he had forgotten how to generate his own. The realization had been devastating, but it had also provided him with a clear path forward. If he wanted to help artists rather than exploit them, he first needed to rediscover his own capacity for authentic creation. The process had been more difficult than he had anticipated. His fingers, once confident on keyboards and familiar with every chord progression that could manipulate an audience's emotions, now felt clumsy and uncertain. His ear, trained to identify commercial potential in other people's music, seemed incapable of evaluating his own compositions without cynical calculation interfering with genuine expression. But gradually, through months of patient daily practice, Marcus had begun to reconnect with the musical instincts that had first drawn him to art as a teenager. He started by playing simple melodies, children's songs and folk tunes that bypassed his analytical tendencies and connected directly to emotional memory. Slowly, he had begun to compose small pieces, fragments of melody that emerged from feeling, rather than strategy. Today's session was different because Marcus was attempting something more ambitious than the brief musical sketches that had occupied his recent months. He was trying to write a complete song, one that told a story he had never been brave enough to articulate during his years in the music industry. The song was about his parents, the Chinese immigrants who had sacrificed everything to provide him with opportunities they could never have imagined for themselves. It was about the weight of carrying other people's dreams while losing touch with your own aspirations. It was about success that felt hollow, because it had been achieved through compromising the values that had originally motivated the pursuit of excellence. Marcus placed his fingers on the piano keys and began to play a melody that had been developing in his mind for weeks. The tune was simple but emotionally complex, incorporating harmonic elements from traditional Chinese music that his parents had played in their restaurant while weaving in jazz progressions that reflected his own American musical education. As he played, lyrics began to emerge, words about the gap between immigrant parents' expectations and their children's authentic desires, about the way cultural assimilation could disconnect you from both your heritage and your adopted country, about finding a way to honor family sacrifice while still pursuing personal truth. The song was more personal than anything Marcus had ever attempted to create during his industry career. It contained vulnerabilities he had never shared with anyone, emotions he had suppressed in favor of professional advancement. But for the first time in years, the act of creation felt like emotional necessity rather than commercial calculation. As winter deepened into February, Marcus's daily routine had settled into a rhythm that felt both monastic and restorative. He woke before dawn and spent the first 2 hours of each day reading, not industry publications or market research, but poetry and philosophy that helped him reconnect with the emotional foundations of artistic expression. After breakfast, he practiced piano for 3 hours, working on both technical exercises and original compositions. The afternoons were devoted to walking in the mountains, allowing his subconscious mind to process the musical ideas he had explored during his morning sessions. But it was the evenings that had become most important to his recovery process. As darkness fell across the Adirondack landscape, Marcus would light a fire in the cabin's stone fireplace and sit with his guitar, playing songs by artists who had maintained their authenticity despite commercial pressure. He studied the work of musicians like Nina Simone, who had never compromised her artistic vision for market demands, and Bob Dylan, who had repeatedly reinvented himself according to internal rather than external imperatives. Through this immersion in authentic artistry, Marcus gradually began to understand what had gone wrong during his industry years. He had become so focused on identifying and amplifying other people's commercial potential that he had lost touch with the emotional honesty that made music meaningful in the first place. His success had been built on his ability to manipulate artistic expression to achieve predetermined outcomes, rather than supporting artists in their authentic creative development. The realization was painful, but it was also liberating. For the first time since his early 20s, Marcus was creating music because he needed to express something true, rather than because he was trying to achieve a commercial goal. The songs he was writing in the cabin would never be heard by industry, executives, or evaluated for their market potential. They existed purely as explorations of his own emotional landscape, attempts to articulate experiences he had never found the courage to examine honestly. One evening in early March, as snowmelt began to create streams that flowed down the mountainsides, Like liquid music, Marcus received an unexpected phone call that would test whether his months of isolation had genuinely transformed his relationship with artistic creation. The caller was Carmen Santos, though she didn't identify herself immediately. Instead, she began the conversation by asking if Marcus was interested in contributing to a collaborative album being produced by Creative Sanctuary, the non-profit organization that specialized in helping artists recover from industry exploitation. We're creating a collection of songs by musicians who have experienced different forms of creative manipulation, Carmen explained. The goal is to demonstrate that authentic artistry can emerge from the process of healing rather than being destroyed by traumatic industry experiences. Marcus recognized the name Creative Sanctuary from his research into resources that might help Zara, though he was careful not to reveal his connection to the organization. "What kind of contribution are you looking for?" he asked. "We're interested in perspectives from all sides of industry relationships," Carmen replied. "Artists who have been exploited, but also industry professionals who recognize that they participated in systems that prioritized commercial success over artistic integrity." The invitation was both an opportunity and a test. Marcus could contribute a song that demonstrated his genuine artistic recovery, but doing so would also require him to publicly acknowledge his history of creative manipulation. The album would force him to be honest about his past behavior while demonstrating his commitment to a different approach to music. "I would need to contribute under my real name," Marcus said. "And I would want to be completely transparent about my history in the industry." "That's exactly what we're hoping for," Carmen replied. "Authentic accountability as part of the healing process." Over the following weeks, Marcus worked on a composition specifically for the Creative Sanctuary album. The song, titled Parasite, was a brutally honest examination of how he had used other people's creativity to compensate for his own artistic emptiness. The lyrics described the psychological patterns that had led him to manipulate artists like Elena Rodriguez, the way success had corrupted his relationship with authentic expression, and his ongoing attempts to rediscover his own creative voice. The musical arrangement was deliberately sparse, just piano and vocals, with no production, techniques that might distract from the directness of his confession. Marcus wanted the song to feel like testimony rather than performance, an act of accountability rather than artistic showcasing. When he submitted the recording to Creative Sanctuary, Marcus included a written statement explaining his motivation for participating in the project. "This song represents my attempt to take responsibility for the ways I have damaged other artists' creative confidence through manipulation and exploitation. I'm contributing to this album not to rehabilitate my reputation, but to acknowledge that genuine artistic recovery requires honesty about the harm we have caused others, as well as the harm we have experienced ourselves." The response from Creative Sanctuary was swift and positive. Carmen called to let him know that Parasite would be included in the album, which was scheduled for release in the fall. More importantly, she shared that the organization's board had been impressed by Marcus's willingness to participate without asking for any form of rehabilitation or forgiveness. "What you've done is rare in the industry," Carmen explained. "Most executives who acknowledge their mistakes do so as part of a comeback strategy. Your contribution feels like genuine accountability." As spring arrived in the Adirondacks, bringing with it the sound of birds returning from their winter migrations, Marcus found himself contemplating what his life might look like once his year of creative isolation came to an end. He had no desire to return to the music industry in any executive capacity, but he was beginning to imagine ways he might use his experience to support authentic artistry without corrupting it. The possibility that excited him most was teaching, not at a prestigious conservatory where students were already being prepared for industry careers, but at community centers and non-profit organizations where people created music out of necessity rather than ambition. Marcus envisioned himself working with artists who had been marginalized by the commercial music business, helping them develop technical skills without imposing his own aesthetic preferences or commercial calculations. But first, he needed to complete the personal artistic project that had been the focus of his mountain retreat. Marcus had been working toward recording a complete album of his own compositions, songs that explored his family history, his cultural identity, and his journey from authentic passion to industry corruption to attempted recovery. The album would serve multiple purposes. It would be his demonstration to himself that he could create complete artistic works rather than just fragments. It would provide him with a body of work he could share with students as an example of honest creative expression, and it would serve as evidence that his transformation was genuine rather than strategic. As he worked on the final songs for what he had tentatively titled Frequency Recovery, Marcus found himself thinking often about Zara, wondering whether she had successfully navigated her own journey back to artistic authenticity. He had kept his promise to Elena Rodriguez by avoiding any attempt to contact Zara or research her progress, but he hoped that her talent and determination had led her to the kind of creative fulfillment he was finally beginning to experience. Himself, the irony wasn't lost on him that his encounter with Zara's authentic artistry had catalyzed his own return to genuine creative expression. She had reminded him, through the purity of her subway performances, of what music could be when it emerged from emotional necessity rather than commercial calculation. In trying to support her artistic development, he had inadvertently rediscovered his own capacity for authentic creation, but Marcus also understood that his personal recovery didn't absolve him of responsibility for the damage he had caused to other artists' creative confidence. The songs he was writing in his mountain cabin were not an attempt to earn forgiveness, but rather an exploration of what accountability might look like when it was expressed through authentic artistic creation rather than public relations strategies. As summer approached and Marcus prepared to record the final versions of his album, he reflected on how profoundly his relationship with music had changed during his year of isolation. For the first time since his teenage years, he was creating art because he needed to, rather than because he thought others might want him to. The transformation felt fragile, but genuine, like a plant that had been transplanted from artificial conditions into soil where it might finally develop natural roots. 2 years after his retreat to the Adirondacks, Marcus stood in the back of a small community center in Brooklyn, watching Zara perform for an audience of 30 people who had gathered on folding chairs arranged in a semicircle around a makeshift stage. The venue was humble, fluorescent lighting, scuffed linoleum floors, the faint smell of coffee from the kitchen where volunteers sold homemade cookies to support local arts programming. But the atmosphere was electric, with the kind of genuine appreciation that Marcus had forgotten could exist between artists and audiences. Zara was performing songs from her independently released album, Clear Frequencies, which had gained recognition, not through industry promotion, but through organic word of mouth from listeners who recognized authentic artistry when they heard it. Her voice had gained power and confidence over the past 2 years, but it had retained the emotional honesty that had first captured Marcus's attention in the subway tunnel. Tonight's performance was part of a touring series organized by Creative Sanctuary, bringing artists who had recovered from industry manipulation to communities that rarely had access to live music. The shows were deliberately small and intimate, designed to create genuine connection between performers and audiences rather than the artificial spectacle that characterized most commercial concerts. Marcus had learned about the performance through Creative Sanctuary's newsletter, which he had subscribed to after contributing Parasite to their collaborative album. He hadn't planned to attend. He had maintained his promise to avoid any contact with Zara, but something about the venue and the nature of the event had convinced him that his presence might go unnoticed in the small crowd. As Zara moved through her setlist, Marcus found himself experiencing music as a pure emotional exchange for the first time in years. He wasn't analyzing her performance for commercial potential or comparing her growth to industry benchmarks. He was simply listening to an artist share her authentic experience with people who appreciated her courage in doing so. The highlight of her performance was a new song called Underground Rivers, which explored the hidden connections between people who had experienced similar forms of creative trauma. The lyrics spoke about the way authentic artists often found each other through invisible networks of mutual recognition, creating communities that existed parallel to commercial entertainment structures. Sometimes, the most important conversations happen in the spaces no one else is watching, Zara sang, her voice carrying both vulnerability and strength. Where broken artists teach each other how to trust their own voices again. As she sang, Marcus realized that the subway platform where he had first encountered her music had become a metaphor for all the hidden spaces where authentic creativity survived despite commercial pressure to conform or compromise. Platform 7 had been their accidental laboratory for genuine artistic connection, the place where both of them had learned something essential about the relationship between honesty and art. During the intermission, Marcus stepped outside the community center to process the emotional intensity of watching Zara perform without being able to acknowledge their shared history. The evening air was crisp with early autumn, and he could hear fragments of conversation from other audience members who were discussing how much Zara's music had meant to them during their own periods of creative struggle. When he returned for the second half of the performance, Marcus was surprised to discover that the final song would be performed by both Zara and Elena Rodriguez, who had joined the tour for this particular show. Elena walked onto the small stage, carrying an acoustic guitar, and the two women embraced with the warmth of people who had supported each other through parallel journeys of artistic recovery. This last song is for everyone who has ever had to choose between commercial success and creative integrity, Elena announced to the audience. It's about the courage to start over when you realize that what you thought was success was actually a form of creative imprisonment. Together, Zara and Elena performed a duet called Frequency Match, a composition that blended both of their musical styles while telling the story of artists who had found their way back to authentic expression after escaping manipulative industry. Relationships. Their voices harmonized with the natural chemistry of people who understood each other's experiences without needing to explain the details. As Marcus listened to the two women whose careers he had impacted so differently, one through direct manipulation, the other through deceptive mentorship, he felt a complex mixture of grief and gratitude. Their collaboration represented everything he had failed to achieve during his industry career: genuine artistic partnership based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics. But watching them perform together also gave Marcus hope that redemption might be possible for people who were willing to completely reconstruct their relationship with creativity. Both Zara and Elena had not only recovered from their experiences with him, they had used those experiences as raw material for art that might help other people navigate similar challenges. After the performance ended and the audience began to disperse, Marcus lingered in the community center, reluctant to leave without somehow acknowledging what he had witnessed. As he gathered his jacket, he noticed that Elena was standing near the merchandise table, signing copies of the Creative Sanctuary collaborative album that included his song Parasite. Elena looked up as he approached, and Marcus saw recognition in her eyes, followed by something that might have been surprise or curiosity. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I read about the show in the newsletter," Marcus replied. "I wanted to hear how Zara's music had developed." Elena studied his face, as if trying to determine whether his presence represented a threat to the supportive environment Creative Sanctuary was trying to create. "She's become everything she was meant to be," Elena said finally, "completely independent of any influence you might have had during your subway encounters." Marcus nodded, feeling both relief and a sharp awareness of how completely he had been erased from Zara's artistic development. "I'm glad," he said, and meant it entirely. "Your song on our album," Elena continued. "It was brave of you to be so honest about your motivations and methods." "It was necessary," Marcus replied, "not for my reputation, but for my own understanding of what I had done to people like you." Elena was quiet for a moment, then glanced toward the stage, where Zara was packing up her equipment. "She doesn't know you're here," Elena said, "and I think it's better if it stays that way. Her recovery has been about learning to trust her own artistic instincts without worrying about external validation or criticism." Marcus understood that Elena was protecting Zara from the potential emotional complexity of an unexpected encounter with him. Even though his presence at the show had been motivated by genuine appreciation rather than manipulation, any contact between them would inevitably be filtered through the history of his deception. "I have no intention of approaching her," Marcus said. "I just needed to witness what authentic artistic development looks like when it's not corrupted by industry interference." As Marcus prepared to leave the community center, Elena offered him an unexpected observation that would stay with him for years afterward. "You know," she said, "the fact that you can appreciate Zara's music without needing to be part of it, that might be the first genuinely supportive thing you've ever done for an artist." Marcus drove back to his cabin in the mountains that night, with Elena's words echoing in his mind. For the first time since his career collapse, he felt that he might have learned something valuable from his failures, not just about the music industry, but about the difference between supporting creativity and exploiting it. Over the following months, Marcus continued his work with Creative Sanctuary as an anonymous donor and occasional contributor to their educational programs. He never sought credit for his involvement or attempted to use his participation to rehabilitate his public reputation. Instead, he focused on developing teaching methods that helped other industry professionals recognize and change manipulative patterns in their relationships with artists. His mountain cabin became a retreat center where music industry workers could spend time reconnecting with their authentic motivations for working in music. The program attracted A&R representatives, producers, and label executives who had begun to question whether their professional success was worth the creative destruction it often required. Marcus also completed his personal album, Frequency Recovery, though he chose not to release it commercially. Instead, he used the songs as teaching tools, sharing them with students as examples of how authentic creative expression could emerge from honest self-examination rather than commercial calculation. 5 years after the confrontation on Platform 7, Marcus received a package with no return address containing a vinyl record. The album was titled Underground Networks and credited to the Frequency Collective, a group of artists who had connected through Creative Sanctuary's programs and decided to create collaborative music that celebrated authentic artistic community. The liner notes included a simple acknowledgement for everyone who has learned that the most important music happens in the spaces between what the industry wants and what your heart needs to express. Marcus listened to the album in his cabin as snow began to fall outside his windows, recognizing musical influences and emotional themes that could be traced back to the subway platform, where he had first encountered the possibility of redemption through honest artistic expression. The music was beautiful and complex, created by artists who had found their way back to authentic creativity after surviving various forms of industry manipulation. But the most meaningful discovery was that he could appreciate the album without needing to be part of it, without feeling compelled to offer suggestions or claim credit for any influence he might have had on the artists involved. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus experienced pure aesthetic pleasure, uncomplicated by professional calculation or personal agenda. As the record played and winter settled over the Adirondack Mountains, Marcus understood that redemption in the music industry, like authentic creativity itself, required the courage to support something beautiful without needing to possess or control it. The lesson had cost him everything he thought he wanted, but it had given him something more valuable, the ability to hear music the way he had as a teenager, when art felt like magic rather than commerce. Sometimes the most profound transformations happen not in the spotlight of public attention, but in the quiet spaces where broken people learn to create beauty again. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give an artist is the freedom to develop without your interference. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is disappear completely, trusting that authentic creativity will find its way to the people who need it most. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever struggled to find your authentic voice in a world that wants to shape you into something else, remember that your most honest expression is always worth protecting. The courage to create authentically, even when no one seems to be listening, is what keeps art alive in a world that often prioritizes profit over truth. Like this video if you believe in the power of authentic creativity, and subscribe to our channel for more stories about people who choose artistic integrity over commercial success. Because sometimes the most important conversations happen in the underground spaces where real artists learn to trust their own voices again.